Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the ACC and Florida State and Clemson, as well as the House versus NCAA case with our two guests, Andrew Tate and Samantha Genzer. Thank you so much to those two coming on. Hopefully, the audio worked better this time around instead of what it was on Friday, which was downright annoying. I'll be totally honest with you. But let's jump into Utah and let's talk about them possibly looking to leave the Big 12. And I think that is a big confusing headline to see. I'm sure a lot of you were looking at that and thinking they're not even in the Big 12 yet, and that's the exact same reaction that I had. Dick Weiss believes Utah could be moving on, finding their way into the ACC at some point here pretty shortly, and that would be quite the mix-up to the world that we've kind of created here. Obviously, I think all of us have gotten pretty comfortable with the way that conference realignment and all of this stuff works. I think all of us know not to let your guard down and think that we're safe for any moment, but this is something that I did not expect, frankly. I'll be totally honest with you, and from a pure, sporting perspective, I don't much understand it. Now, Tate just brought up a fantastic point with the research dollars and Utah wanting to be a little bit better in that kind of realm, so the ACC would be a better fit there. But if we're talking purely from a football perspective, which is what I'll do for the next little bit here, it doesn't make much sense to me. When you're looking at this football team going into the Big 12 as of this second, the sky is the limit, essentially, for this team. They can do any number of things and can do remarkable things in the Big 12. I think everyone, including myself, is pointing to them to be the team to beat in this upcoming year, and I would keep it that way for quite some time. As long as Kyle Whittingham is in the building, I don't think there's any worry about Utah being a good football program. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch. Obviously, from a financial perspective, when you look at the TV dollars and all of that type of thing for the sports in particular, it also doesn't necessarily make sense. It feels like the Big 12 is starting to kind of move above the ACC in terms of when you look at the breakdown of the college football playoff distribution is the best way to put it. I think you saw the ACC a little bit above the Big 12, right? And I think that made sense. You had Clemson, you had Florida State, you had UNC, all of these teams. But now all of those teams might be trying to find their way out. And obviously that number will drop because of that. And I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how that impacts the ACC in these new discussions and how much money they're bringing in on a regular basis, but also how it impacts kind of the Big 12, because the Big 12, from where I was standing, was the conference that I would buy stock in the most, and it's because of Brett Yormark, their commissioner. This guy came from TV. He fully understands what it's like to be in those discussions and fully understands what it's like to negotiate, and I don't think anyone in any of the power conferences and any of the schools want to go to battle with Brett Yormark right about now. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this. I think Utah is a team that a lot of us are watching very closely, right? A lot of us are putting a lot of energy into whether they're in the Big 12 or the ACC in the coming years. I think they're going to be a team to be reckoned with. I don't necessarily think it opens more doors for them to be a better team if they go into the ACC. I think maybe if Florida State and Clemson find their way out, they still have that ability. But if they come in, maybe North Carolina stays, and then you have to battle with North Carolina, Virginia Tech, Miami, some of the other teams that are in there. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think there's a number of scenarios where Utah decides to stay put and thinks that the Big 12 is the best fit for them, at least in the sporting world. And then there's a ton of realities where they move over to the ACC. I frankly think that's probably what's going to happen if there's so much money in research dollars and all of the stuff that is currently being thrown out the window, essentially, is currently not being utilized to the degree that it should be in the Big 12. They're going to make their way over to the ACC. We just talked about it in the last segment. That's where a lot of this money comes from, especially for some schools that might not have the best athletic departments, and not saying Utah necessarily falls into that group, but they don't necessarily fall into the Ohio State, Georgia, Alabamas of the world either. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think when you look at the ACC right now, it looks like a sinking ship, at least from the outside in, right? You look at Florida State, you look at Clemson, North Carolina, and Miami kind of eyeing that door as well. You get more and more worried about the future of this conference, about the future of the sport without the ACC a part of it. But you bring in Utah and it subsides at least a little bit of that. Obviously, losing Clemson and Florida State is not the easiest thing to replace, and especially if you lose North Carolina and maybe Duke, NC State, all of those teams, then you have a real problem on your hands, because one of the caveats of all this, one of the overarching things around the ACC right now is do not fall below 15 teams. They're at 17 right now, but say Florida State and Clemson find their way out, then they're right on that line, and then it just takes North Carolina, getting out in the forefront for that to become a big-time problem. And if they fall below 15 teams, the issue becomes even larger, because the ESPN media deal would be void at that point. The ESPN media deal has said if they are at 15 teams or more, we are in. If they drop below 15 teams, we're out, essentially, is the gist of what they said. And it's a huge deal, right? You look at the ACC right now, the only thing that's really propping them up is ESPN. And it's the reason, really, Utah wants to get involved as much as they do, at least from a, TV deal, sports side, because they have a really good relationship with ESPN. They did in the Pac-12, and they will. They won't necessarily in the Big 12 quite as much. They deal with more Fox in the Big 12 and a little bit of ESPN here and there, but not nearly as much as the ACC, who has pretty much an exclusive deal with ESPN, and definitely will have a much more of a presence on those channels. Excuse me, I lost my words there. But yeah, I think Utah getting into the ACC is definitely something that they want because of the tie to ESPN. They want because of the research dollars. They want for a number of different reasons. I think the question is, the biggest question really here is, what does the Big 12 look like after this? Because the Big 12 currently is sitting at, I think, 18 teams. I could be wrong about that. 16 teams, because they lost 2, they added 4. But currently at 16 teams, let's say Utah finds its way out. Then you're going shopping again if you're Brett Yormark. And I think the question becomes, Utah found their way over to the ACC. Does Brett Yormark try to poach some of the ACC teams? Because that's honestly the way that I thought this was going to go. I thought that ACC teams were going to start to kind of look at the door even more, and then the Big 12 was going to be a great recipient for a number of those teams. But it seems like it might be going the other way, at least for the time being. That doesn't mean that Brett Yormark can't get on the phone and possibly subside that a little bit by using his remarkable ability to negotiate. To negotiate and know all of the things that are happening in this sport, especially on the TV side of things. So I think it's something that we'll definitely have to continue to unpack on this show. I think it's something that when you look at the ACC right now, it is at very best a very teetering ship and a very confusing thing to watch. If you add Utah, at least you get a little bit more stable. At least you have a little bit of a backup plan when you lose Clemson and Florida State, because I think we can all agree they're out the door. They've been out the door pretty much from the second that they started all of these talks, all of these lawsuits, everything that started happening. They were going to find a way out. And Florida State has amended their argument probably 10 different times to make sure that they find their way out. So I think that's a done deal. I think we all understand that. If we talk about North Carolina, that's the big domino, as we just talked about in the last segment. But you bring in Utah, maybe you don't lose North Carolina. Maybe you don't lose Miami. Maybe you don't lose Duke. And as Andrew Tate just said, Duke and North Carolina are the heart of the ACC. When you think about the ACC, you think about that rivalry. Although there are plenty of fantastic rivalries in that conference, none come close to what UNC and Duke is in basketball. I think you could make the argument, I probably would make the argument, that it's the best rivalry in all of college sports. So it is something that is going to be fascinating to watch. If you can bring in Utah, or at least give your guys the idea that Utah is coming in from Jim Phillips' perspective, the ACC commissioner, if you can sell that to all of your schools, maybe they don't leave, and maybe you get to hang out and have a little bit bigger of a West footprint and have all of those research dollars and have all the schools in there that kind of fit the same mold, right? All of them would be kind of research-based, really great academic schools, and Utah would fit in perfectly. And then, the questions of would Utah or would some of these other schools want to move on to the Big 10 or SEC in the future, that's something you can deal with down the road. But as of right now, I mean, you're dealing with Clemson and Florida State out front. And if they leave, you're down to 15 teams. If you can add Utah, maybe before that happens or shortly thereafter, you're back up to 16. At least you have a little bit of a buffer and you can work from there. So this is something that, frankly, I didn't think was going to happen. I thought the ACC was just going to slowly kind of sink into the ocean, if I'm being totally honest with you, and slowly lose teams until, North Carolina and Duke joined in, and then it was going to be kind of a free-for-all, kind of like the Pac-12 was a year ago. A big reason that Utah is in the Big 12, because I think if you went back and all of this Pac-12 talk started a couple of years ago, instead of, all happening in what felt like, 12 months, 9 months, it felt like everyone had to find their way out of that conference. I think Utah would have looked more at the ACC, or would have looked very aggressively at the Big Ten. I think that's probably where they wanted to be. But when you're battling Oregon, USC, UCLA, and Washington, it's going to be a tough time to get that to go. Now, could they do that down the road? Absolutely. But it's definitely one of those interesting things where you wake up one day and the ACC is essentially dead and looks like it's going to be heading for a really, really tough time. And then a big-time program like Utah kind of comes out of the clouds and possibly saves them. And obviously the ACC might be saving them as well, with some of the different implications of being in the Big 12. But it's fascinating. It's one of those things that I never really thought was going to be the case. It's something that I thought Utah was just going to hang out in the Big 12 and really kind of tear apart that conference for the next little bit, at least in football, and keep it moving and maybe move up to the Big 10 at some point. But I thought we were at at least somewhat of a resting point with some of this stuff. But before even the new conferences have taken shape, we have someone possibly moving on from their conference. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think all of this stuff has always caught us off guard. I don't think there's any conference realignment that would feel normal at this point, but Utah especially going from a one conference to another, and then before they even get into that one, finding their way over to the ACC would be quite the story. But we'll definitely keep our eye on that. We'll definitely make sure you guys are fully up to date on that. But we're going to take our third break here, and after we come back, we're going to talk about the most important coaches for all of the contenders. We're going to go through Georgia, Texas, Bama, Ohio State, and Oregon today. We'll continue this probably throughout the week, just getting every contender out there. But these are the 5 that I'm really circling for this upcoming year. So I wanted to break that down right after this, so stick with us.